In January 1904, more than 300 workers dropped their tools at exactly the same moment on a frozen island in upstate New York. They never picked them up again. The project they were abandoning? A 6-story, 120-room castle that had already consumed what would be $70 million in today's money. The owner, George C. Boldt, one of America's wealthiest hotel magnates with a fortune equivalent to roughly $500 million today, sent a single telegram: stop all construction immediately. And here's what no one's talking about. Those workers left behind hammers mid-swing, mortar still wet, granite blocks suspended on pulleys, an entire island paradise frozen in the exact moment heartbreak arrived. This wasn't a business failure. This wasn't bankruptcy or scandal. This was something the Gilded Age's robber barons couldn't buy their way out of, the sudden crushing weight of personal tragedy that turned America's most extravagant love story into its most haunting monument to loss. We're talking about Boldt Castle, and the numbers alone should shock you. Over $2.5 million spent between 1900 and 1904, which translates to approximately $70 to $80 million today. An entire island reshaped, hundreds of tons of European stone imported, a private power plant built from scratch, Italian gardens designed by the same architects who worked for the Vanderbilts, and it was all meant as a Valentine's Day present. But here's the real story nobody tells you. George Boldt didn't abandon this castle because he ran out of money or lost interest. He abandoned it because completing it would have destroyed him. And for 73 years, from 1904 to 1977, this massive stone fortress sat completely open to the elements, slowly crumbling while vandals stripped it bare and weather ravaged its interiors. The irony? It was only saved when someone bought it for literally $1. $1 for a castle that cost millions. Think about that. If you're ready to see what really happened when unlimited wealth met unstoppable grief, when the ultimate symbol of love became a monument to abandonment, and why this castle's tragic story reveals a truth about the Gilded Age that nobody wants to discuss, let's begin. Now let's look at who George C. Boldt actually was, because understanding his wealth makes the tragedy hit differently. George Boldt arrived in America from Prussia in 1864 at age 13, with essentially nothing. By 1904, he controlled the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, managed hotels for William Waldorf Astor, and had become one of the most powerful figures in American hospitality. His annual income in the early 1900s exceeded $200,000. That's roughly $6 million per year in today's dollars. He didn't just manage hotels, he defined luxury for America's elite. The Waldorf Astoria under Boldt's management became the social center of Gilded Age New York. Cornelius Vanderbilt dined there. John Jacob Astor IV kept a permanent suite. Presidents stayed there. When you controlled the Waldorf Astoria in 1900, you controlled access to power itself. But here's what nobody tells you about George Boldt. He was an immigrant who clawed his way up from washing dishes. He started as a kitchen boy in New York. He didn't inherit a fortune like the Astors or Vanderbilts. Every dollar he made came from understanding what the ultra-wealthy wanted and delivering it flawlessly. By 1895, Boldt had already acquired Hart Island in the Thousand Islands region of New York, paying what would be roughly $75,000 in today's money. The Thousand Islands were becoming the Newport of the North, where industrialists and railroad barons built summer cottages that were actually massive estates. The region counted over 50 millionaire estates by 1900. George and Louise Boldt had been married since 1877. Louise Augusta Carrer came from Philadelphia, and by all accounts their marriage was genuinely loving, unusual in an era when marriages among the wealthy were often strategic alliances. They had 2 children together, Clover and George Jr. Now here's where the scale becomes important. When Boldt decided to transform Hart Island into a castle for Louise, he wasn't planning some modest summer home. We're talking about completely reshaping the island's topography. He had workers blast rock, import thousands of tons of soil, and literally change the island's shape into a heart formation when viewed from above. The architectural firm of G.W. and W.D. Hewitt from Philadelphia was hired. the same firm designing mansions for industrial titans across America. The plans called for a 6-story castle modeled after Rhineland castles, with 120 rooms spanning approximately 58,000 square feet. For comparison, the average Gilded Age mansion ran about 15,000 to 20,000 square feet. Boldt was building something 3 times larger than typical. But that wasn't the real vision. Boldt planned an entire complex, a powerhouse to generate electricity for the island, an Ulster Tower as a playhouse and lookout point, a massive stone arch entry, underground tunnels connecting buildings, Italian gardens with imported statuary, a yacht house that was itself larger than most people's homes, spanning 10,000 square feet with slips for multiple vessels. The numbers keep stacking. More than 300 workers were employed year-round, including European stone carvers brought specifically for the decorative work. Winter work continued despite brutal conditions. We're talking about workers chiseling stone in temperatures that regularly dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit. Construction proceeded at a pace that would be considered reckless even today. Here's what makes this different from other Gilded Age building projects. Boldt was racing against time for a Valentine's Day 1905 completion. He wanted to present Louise with the finished castle on their anniversary. Every delay meant another year waiting, and Boldt was 53 years old in 1900, old enough to feel mortality breathing down his neck. So by early 1904, the project was nearing completion. The exterior stonework was largely finished, interior spaces were framed, artisans were beginning the detailed work, hand-carved wood paneling, elaborate plaster ceilings, custom ironwork. The Italian gardens were planted, the powerhouse was operational, the yacht house stood complete. Boldt was managing all of this while simultaneously running the Waldorf Astoria remotely, which tells you something about his organizational abilities. He had essentially unlimited funds and absolute determination. And then, in January 1904, everything stopped. Now, let's look at what actually happened, because the timing reveals something crucial that most people miss. Louise Boldt died on January 7, 1904. She was 41 years old. The cause of death was listed as heart failure, though some historical accounts suggest complications from illness that had been developing over the previous months. She died at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, surrounded by the luxury her husband had created, but far from the island castle built in her honor. Within days, some accounts say within 48 hours, George Boldt sent the telegram to Hart Island. Stop all construction immediately, dismiss all workers, abandon the project. The exact wording has been lost to history, but the effect was instantaneous and absolute. Here's what nobody talks about. Those workers literally walked away from active construction. Tools were left where they fell. Wet mortar hardened in mixing troughs. Blocks of imported granite remained on pulleys. Partially completed rooms stayed exactly as they were, mid-task. It wasn't an orderly shutdown, it was an amputation. 300 workers suddenly unemployed in rural upstate New York in January. Think about that. No severance pay mentioned in historical records, no gradual wind-down, just immediate cessation. The Thousand Islands region's economy took a hit because Boldt's project had been pumping money into local contractors and suppliers for 4 solid years. George Boldt never set foot on Hart Island again. Never, not once in the remaining 12 years of his life. A man who had invested what amounts to $70 to $80 million today couldn't bear to see the monument to his wife incomplete. But here's the part that should make you pause. Boldt didn't sell the island. He didn't demolish the castle. He didn't even secure it against vandalism. He simply ordered it abandoned and then ignored its existence completely. For a man known for meticulous attention to detail, this was psychological devastation manifest as deliberate neglect. The records show Boldt continued managing the Waldorf Astoria until his death in 1916. He remained enormously wealthy. He could have completed the castle as a memorial. He could have converted it to a different use. He could have gifted it to the state or turned it into a resort. He did nothing. Here's the real problem. George Boldt wasn't just grieving a spouse. He was confronting the central lie of the Gilded Age, that wealth could insulate you from life's fundamental tragedies. He had built an empire on making the impossible possible for rich clients. He could arrange anything, procure anything, create any experience money could buy. And then his wife died at 41, and all that power meant nothing. So the castle sat, and sat, and sat. Now, let's look at what happens when you abandon a multi-million-dollar structure in upstate New York for 7 decades, because the numbers on the destruction are staggering. From 1904 to 1977, Boldt Castle received zero maintenance, none. We're talking about a 58,000 square foot stone building with a slate roof, hundreds of windows, elaborate plasterwork, and wooden interior elements completely exposed to the elements for 73 years. The Thousand Islands region experiences harsh winters with heavy snow, ice storms, and freeze-thaw cycles that destroy masonry. Summers bring humidity and rain that rot wood and corrode metal. The windows were the first to go. By the 1920s, most of the glass had been shattered by vandals or blown out by winter storms. Once the windows failed, weather had free access to the interiors. Rain and snow poured directly into the grand ballroom. Ice formed on the elaborate staircases. Wind howled through empty corridors. Here's the scale of vandalism. Between the 1920s and 1960s, virtually every removable fixture was stolen. Copper pipes ripped from walls, brass doorknobs pried off, marble mantles sledgehammered into chunks and hauled away. Light fixtures, radiators, decorative ironwork, all stripped and sold as scrap. Some estimates suggest vandals stole over $1 million worth of materials in today's dollars. The roof went next. Slate tiles, even high-quality imported slate, fail without maintenance. By the 1940s, significant portions of the roof were gone, meaning rain fell directly into upper-floor rooms. This accelerated interior decay exponentially. Plaster ceilings collapsed, wooden floors rotted through, walls stained with water damage and mold. But here's what nobody tells you. The castle became a destination for vandals and curiosity seekers, specifically because of its abandonment. Local teenagers held parties in the ruins. Graffiti covered walls. People carved initials into hand-carved woodwork that had cost thousands to create. The more famous the ruin became, the more damage it sustained. The Ulster Tower, Boldt's playhouse structure, suffered similar fate. The yacht house lost its boat slips to ice damage. The powerhouse had its copper wiring and machinery stripped. The underground tunnels flooded and collapsed in sections. The Italian gardens became overgrown tangles where imported statuary toppled and broke. By 1960, architectural preservationists were calling Boldt Castle one of America's most significant endangered landmarks. But here's the problem. It was still privately owned by the Boldt estate, and the family had shown zero interest in maintaining or selling it for over 50 years. The Thousand Islands Bridge Authority, a public entity managing the international bridges in the region, had been eyeing the property since the 1950s. Tourism was becoming important to the region's economy, and this dramatic ruin was already attracting visitors despite being officially closed and unsafe. In 1977, the authority made an offer, $1 for Hart Island and all its structures. $1. The Boldt estate accepted. Think about that transaction for a moment. A property that had consumed millions to build, that occupied premium waterfront real estate, sold for less than a cup of coffee. But here's the real reason the family let it go for $1. The property had become a liability. Annual property taxes, insurance concerns, potential lawsuits if someone got hurt exploring the dangerous ruin. The estate wanted it gone, and the Bridge Authority offered a solution. The authority's plan wasn't to restore Boldt Castle to its original vision. That would have cost an estimated $50 to $100 million, even in 1977. Instead, they planned to stabilize it, prevent further decay while preserving the romantic ruin aesthetic that had made it famous. Wait a minute. Let's pause there. Preserve the romantic ruin aesthetic. They were planning to maintain it as an incomplete monument to loss because that's what tourists wanted to see. Not a functioning castle, a tragedy frozen in stone. Now let's look at what restoration actually meant for Boldt Castle, because the approach reveals something fascinating about how we memorialize Gilded Age excess. The Thousand Islands Bridge Authority began work in 1977 with a clear mission: make the castle safe and stable, but keep it visibly unfinished. This wasn't about returning it to 1904 conditions or completing George Boldt's vision. This was about preserving abandonment as a tourist attraction. Initial work focused on the roof. New slate tiles replaced failed sections, but only enough to prevent further water damage, not to complete the original roofing plan. Windows were replaced in critical areas, but left empty in others, creating a patchwork effect. The goal was stabilization, not completion. Here's the scale of work required. By 1977, an estimated 40% of the castle's interior had suffered severe structural damage. Floors had rotted through, supporting beams had deteriorated, staircases had become unsafe. Simply making the building accessible to tourists required over $1 million in immediate work, about $5 million in today's dollars. The Bridge Authority made a crucial decision: open the castle to paid tours and use admission fees to fund ongoing restoration. In 1977, they charged $1.50 per adult visitor. Roughly 30,000 people visited in the first year, generating about $45,000 in revenue. Not nearly enough for serious restoration, but a start. But here's what nobody talks about. The restoration strategy created a bizarre hybrid. Some rooms were restored to near original condition, while others remained completely ruined. The grand ballroom received new plaster and paint. The stone entry hall was cleaned and repaired, but upstairs, bedrooms stayed water-stained and empty. Service corridors remained stripped and graffitied. This approach meant visitors experienced both the vision and its failure simultaneously. You'd walk through a beautifully restored space into a shell of exposed brick and missing floors. The effect was intentionally jarring, a constant reminder that this castle was never completed, never fulfilled its purpose. By the 1990s, restoration work had expanded. The yacht house received major work, transforming it into a museum and gift shop. The Ulster Tower was stabilized and opened for tours. Gardens were replanted following historical photographs. The powerhouse was partially restored as an interpretive center. Annual visitor numbers climbed. By 2000, over 100,000 people per year were touring Boldt Castle, each paying $6 to $8 for admission. That's over $600,000 in annual revenue dedicated to ongoing restoration. The project had become self-sustaining through tourism, which is exactly what the Bridge Authority had gambled on. Here's the financial reality. Between 1977 and 2024, over $50 million has been spent on Boldt Castle restoration and maintenance. $50 million to preserve an $80 million building that was abandoned because its owner couldn't bear to complete it. We've now spent almost as much preserving the tragedy as was originally spent creating it. Current restoration continues today. Recent projects include recreating the castle's original roof finials, restoring elaborately carved stone details, and completing interior rooms that were never finished in 1904. But here's the contradiction. They're completing rooms that George Boldt deliberately left incomplete. They're finishing what grief stopped. The Italian gardens saw major restoration in the 2000s, with over $2 million spent recreating the original landscaping plan using historical photographs and plant lists. Imported statuary was replicated where originals had been destroyed. Pathways were relaid. The effect is stunning and completely artificial since these gardens were barely planted before abandonment. Wait a minute, let's think about what this means. We're spending tens of millions to complete George Boldt's vision after his death, which is exactly what he refused to do while alive. We're creating the monument to love and excess that he deliberately denied Louise because completing it without her felt like betrayal. Now let's look at the actual financial scale of Boldt Castle across its entire history, because when you add everything up, the numbers reveal something disturbing about how we value tragedy over success. Original construction costs $2.5 million between 1900 to 1904, equivalent to approximately $75 to $80 million today. That's confirmed from Boldt's own records and contractor payments. This covered the castle itself, the Ulster Tower, yacht house, powerhouse, gardens, island reshaping, and all imported materials and European craftsmen. Estimated value of stolen materials during abandonment, $500,000 to $1 million in today's dollars. This includes copper piping, brass fixtures, marble, decorative ironwork, and anything else that could be pried loose and sold as scrap. Some pieces of Boldt Castle's original materials have turned up at antique dealers and salvage yards as far away as Toronto and Boston. Property tax revenue lost during private abandonment, roughly $200,000 in today's dollars across 7 decades. The Boldt estate paid minimal taxes on the deteriorating ruin, far below what a functional property of that size would generate. Cost of restoration work from 1977 to 2024, over $50 million confirmed, with ongoing annual budgets of $2 to $3 million for continued restoration and maintenance. The Bridge Authority has published these figures as part of their public accountability. Total tourism revenue generated 1977 to 2024, estimated at $45 to $50 million based on visitor numbers and admission fees. Current annual visitors exceed 120,000 people, paying $12 to $15 each, generating over $1.5 million yearly. This doesn't include secondary spending at the gift shop, boat tours, and related tourism businesses. Here's what those numbers tell you. We've spent nearly as much money preserving Boldt's abandoned castle as he spent building it. We've done it specifically because it represents failure and tragedy, not success. But let's dig deeper into what that original $2.5 million actually bought, because the itemized costs are staggering. Imported European stone for the exterior, approximately $400,000 period dollars in period dollars, or roughly $12 million today. This was Rhine River stone, selected specifically for its color and quality, shipped across the Atlantic, then barged up the St. Lawrence River. Structural steel and framework, $350,000 in period dollars, about $10.5 million today. This was Carnegie Steel, the same supplier for New York's early skyscrapers. The castle's framework could have supported a much taller building. Boldt wanted absolute stability. Craftsmen and labor, $750,000 in period dollars, roughly $22.5 million today. This includes master stone carvers from Germany and Italy, who spent years on decorative elements, skilled carpenters creating custom woodwork, and the army of general laborers who worked year-round, including brutal winters. Mechanical systems, $200,000 period dollars in period dollars, about $6 million today. This covered the powerhouse with its generators, electrical wiring throughout the castle, plumbing systems, and heating systems. Boldt was installing technology that most rural areas wouldn't see for another decade. Interior finishes, $300,000 in period dollars, approximately $9 million today. Hand-carved mahogany paneling, imported marble for fireplaces, custom plasterwork, decorative ironwork for railings and fixtures. Much of this was never installed because construction stopped, but it had already been purchased and was sitting in storage when the telegram arrived. Landscaping and outbuildings, $500,000 period dollars in period dollars, about $15 million today. The yacht house alone cost what a substantial mansion would cost. The Ulster Tower, the powerhouse, the underground tunnels, reshaping the island itself, these supporting elements rivaled the castle in cost. Here's what nobody tells you. Boldt was spending at a rate that would bankrupt most millionaires. His annual income of $200,000 in 1900 was being entirely consumed by this project, meaning he was likely drawing on accumulated wealth and possibly borrowing against future earnings. The hotel business was lucrative, but this castle was hemorrhaging cash. And then it stopped. All that momentum, all that spending, all that progress just froze. The financial waste is almost incomprehensible. Specialized materials ordered but never used. Craftsmen hired for multi-year contracts suddenly dismissed. Work completed that would never be maintained or finished. Let's put this in modern context. Imagine someone today spending $80 million on a custom mansion, getting it 90% complete, then walking away permanently. The property sits for decades, vandalized and rotting, losing millions more in value. Then, the government buys it for $1 and spends another $50 million preserving it as a ruin. That's Boldt Castle. But here's the real kicker. Boldt's actual net worth at death in 1916 was estimated at $5 to $7 million, or roughly $140 to $200 million today. He didn't go broke building the castle. He remained wealthy. He could have completed it at any time. He chose abandonment instead, which means he valued his grief more than finishing the monument. Think about that choice. Tens of millions wasted, not from lack of funds, but from emotional devastation so complete that finishing the project felt impossible. Now let's address why Boldt Castle's real story gets sanitized, romanticized, and fundamentally misunderstood. Because there are specific reasons this tragedy gets packaged as a love story instead of what it actually represents. Reason 1. The tourism industry needs a romantic narrative, not a cautionary tale about the limits of wealth. Boldt Castle generates over $1.5 million annually in direct admission revenue and supports millions more in regional tourism spending. Gift shops sell greatest love story ever told merchandise. Wedding packages market it as the ultimate romantic gesture. Nobody wants to hear that it's actually a monument to the futility of trying to buy immortality for love through architecture. The marketing materials carefully frame this as a gift of love never completed, rather than a display of extreme wealth abandoned when tragedy proved money can't prevent death. One sells commemorative plates and tour packages. The other forces uncomfortable questions about Gilded Age excess. Guess which version gets promoted? Reason 2. Preserving it as a romantic ruin justifies the massive public expenditure on ongoing restoration. If Boldt Castle is the ultimate love story, then spending $50 million in public funds to maintain it seems reasonable. If it's actually a monument to one wealthy man's inability to cope with loss while thousands of workers lost employment and millions in value evaporated, suddenly that public spending looks different. The Thousand Islands Bridge Authority is a public entity. They answer to taxpayers. Framing this as cultural preservation of a heartwarming story is much easier than explaining why public money should preserve a rich man's abandoned vanity project. The romantic narrative provides political cover for the restoration budget. Reason 3. Acknowledging what this really represents requires confronting uncomfortable truths about the Gilded Age that contradict our cultural mythology. We want to believe that era was about American entrepreneurship and building beautiful things. Boldt Castle, in its unfinished state, actually shows that even the wealthiest couldn't escape human suffering, that massive expenditures could be rendered meaningless by a single death, and that the monuments to excess often became monuments to waste. The contemporaries of Boldt saw this abandonment for what it was, a dramatic failure and waste that embarrassed the family. Modern tourism has reframed it as romantic tragedy, which is much more palatable than wealthy hotel magnate fails to cope with grief, abandons $80 million project out of spite against fate. Reason 4. The story as typically told erases the 300 workers who lost employment in the middle of a New York winter with no warning. These were real people with families who depended on those jobs. The project had been employing them year-round for 4 years. They had reasonable expectation of continued work through completion in 1905. But the romantic narrative focuses entirely on George Boldt's heartbreak. His pain is centered. His inability to finish the castle is framed as noble grief. Meanwhile, the workers who were dismissed by telegram, who left tools mid-swing, who suddenly had no income, they're footnotes if mentioned at all. This erases the human cost of Boldt's dramatic abandonment. Reason 5. Admitting that we've spent nearly as much preserving the ruin as Boldt spent creating it raises questions about our cultural priorities. $50 million on stabilizing and partially completing an abandoned rich man's castle. How many schools could that fund? How many roads could be repaired? How many social services could be provided? The romantic framing sidesteps this by positioning Boldt Castle as culturally significant heritage deserving preservation. And maybe it is. But let's be honest about what we're preserving. Not a completed vision, not functional architecture, a monument to abandonment that we've decided is worth more incomplete than many completed works of public architecture. Reason 6. The continued restoration work that's actively completing rooms Boldt left unfinished contradicts the very premise of the preservation. If this is supposed to memorialize the tragedy of incompletion, why are we finishing it? The current restoration projects are creating rooms that George Boldt never saw, never approved, never intended in their current form. This reveals that preserving the romantic ruin was always somewhat dishonest. We're not preserving abandonment. We're slowly completing the castle while pretending we're just stabilizing it. We're finishing George Boldt's vision after his death because completed spaces attract more tourism than exposed brick and rotted floors. Reason 7. The real lesson that even unlimited wealth couldn't protect the Boldts from mortality, and that attempting to monumentalize love through excess spending is fundamentally misguided, is uncomfortable for a culture built on consumption and display. If Boldt's millions couldn't save Louise, if his grand gesture became a cautionary tale instead of an achievement, what does that say about our own materialism? Americans want to believe that success can be built, that money creates security, that grand gestures demonstrate love. Boldt Castle actually demonstrates the opposite, that the grandest gesture can become the cruelest reminder, that what you build can hurt you to look at, and that sometimes the most expensive thing you can do is abandon what you've invested in, because completion would be more painful than waste. Here's the part no one's talking about. We've turned Boldt Castle into exactly the kind of romantic spectacle that George Boldt refused to create through completion. He understood that finishing it would transform his genuine grief into performative mourning, would turn Louise's memory into a tourist attraction. We've done it anyway, 70 years later, and called it historic preservation. The irony is brutal. Boldt abandoned the castle to avoid commodifying his loss. We bought it for $1 and commodified it completely. Now let's look at how this exact pattern repeats across time and wealth levels. Because Boldt's mistake isn't unique to the Gilded Age, it's happening right now, just with different assets and different people. Mike Tyson earned over $400 million during his boxing career. By 2003, he filed for bankruptcy with $23 million in debt. His spending during peak earning years included a $2 million bathtub, multiple mansions, a collection of exotic animals, and endless gifts for friends and hangers-on. When financial crisis hit, those assets either had to be liquidated at massive losses or simply abandoned. Several Tyson properties sat vacant for years because he owed more than they were worth. Same pattern, unlimited spending during prosperity, abandonment when circumstances changed. Johnny Depp earned over $650 million between 1983 and 2016, according to his legal team. By 2017, he was reportedly spending $2 million per month and facing serious financial problems. His collection of properties included a French village, private islands, multiple Los Angeles estates, most of which he tried to sell at losses because maintaining them became impossible. The emotional attachment to the purchases made selling them painful, so some sat vacant while hemorrhaging maintenance costs. Boldt's castle, Depp's French village, different centuries, identical psychology. Nicolas Cage earned over $150 million, but faced foreclosure and IRS liens by 2009. His real estate portfolio included castles, islands, and mansions that he purchased impulsively and abandoned when the bills came due. Multiple properties were foreclosed or sold at steep losses. Some sat vacant for years before banks finally forced sales. The purchasing was emotional and excessive. The abandonment was abrupt and total. Here's what connects all these cases to Boldt: spending as emotional expression rather than economic calculation, followed by abandonment when emotions or circumstances change. Boldt built a castle as a love monument and abandoned it when love ended in death. These modern examples built collections as success monuments and abandoned them when success ended in bankruptcy. But it's not just celebrities. Lottery winners show this pattern even more clearly because the timeline is compressed. Research on lottery winners shows that 70% are broke within 5 years, and a significant percentage declare bankruptcy. The National Endowment for Financial Education found that sudden wealth regularly leads to overspending, particularly on real estate and luxury items that later become burdens. Jack Whitaker won $314.9 million in the Powerball in 2002. Within 4 years, he'd been robbed multiple times, sued repeatedly, and lost most of his winnings. His granddaughter died of a drug overdose. He stated in interviews that winning the lottery was the worst thing that ever happened to him. Not because he lost the money, but because the money attracted tragedy he couldn't prevent, despite having unlimited resources. Boldt could relate. Evelyn Adams won the New Jersey lottery twice, totaling $5.4 million. She lost it all through gambling and bad investments. When interviewed, she said, "Winning the lottery isn't always what it's cracked up to be. The money didn't protect her from addiction or poor decisions. Wealth without wisdom leads to waste." Wait a minute. Let's examine what these patterns reveal. Whether it's Gilded Age millionaires or modern lottery winners, sudden or extreme wealth creates a dangerous illusion that money can solve all problems, protect against all tragedies, or create permanent security. George Boldt could afford the best doctors in 1904, but they couldn't save Louise. Modern lottery winners can afford security systems, but they can't prevent betrayal by family members. NFL players earn millions, but 78% face financial difficulties within 2 years of retirement, according to a Sports Illustrated study. The common denominator isn't the amount of money. It's the belief that having it creates immunity from life's fundamental risks. Here's the real problem happening today. Social media has amplified the pressure to demonstrate wealth through display, making the Boldt Castle mistake more common, not less. Instagram influencers rent mansions they can't afford for photo shoots. Entrepreneurs lease luxury cars to project success they haven't achieved. The display becomes more important than the substance. This is the Boldt Castle psychology digitized. He built an enormous monument to demonstrate love, and when love ended, the monument became unbearable. Modern displays create the same trap. When circumstances change, the display becomes evidence of foolishness rather than success. Real estate shows this most clearly today. The luxury housing market is filled with white elephant properties, massive custom homes built for specific wealthy owners that become impossible to sell because they're too personalized, too expensive to maintain, or too excessive for practical use. These are mini Boldt castles, monuments to individual vision that become burdens when circumstances change. The One Bel Air, a Los Angeles mega mansion, was listed for $500 million, sold for $141 million at auction after bankruptcy, and the buyer is now trying to sell at a loss. Versailles in Florida, a 90,000-square-foot mansion featured in the documentary The Queen of Versailles, sat unfinished for years during the 2008 financial crisis. The owners couldn't afford to complete it, but couldn't bear to sell the unfinished dream. Sound familiar? These are direct parallels to Boldt abandoning his 90% complete castle. The emotional investment makes rational economic decisions impossible. And here's the kicker for current times. Climate change is creating modern Boldt castles in coastal areas. Luxury waterfront properties built with no expense spared are now facing regular flooding, erosion, and insurance problems that make them functionally unlivable. Some owners have abandoned properties worth millions because the cost of engineering solutions exceeds any possible return. Miami Beach has multiple luxury condos that face this exact situation. Built for $20 to $30 million, now worth a fraction of that due to flooding risks, too expensive to fortify against rising seas, but too expensive to walk away from. The owners are trapped in the same psychological position as Boldt, unable to complete/fix the project, unable to abandon it, watching it slowly deteriorate while spending money just to slow the decay. This is happening right now, today. The Boldt Castle lesson hasn't been learned because the fundamental human drives remain the same. We demonstrate emotions through spending, we build monuments to what we love, and we discover too late that circumstances beyond our control can turn those monuments into millstones. Now, let's look at what wealth actually meant in the Gilded Age versus what people thought it meant, because this gap explains why Boldt could build a castle but couldn't cope with abandoning it. In 1904, George Boldt's annual income of $200,000 put him in approximately the top 0.01% of American earners. For context, the average American worker earned about $400 annually. Boldt earned in 3 days what most Americans earned in a year. This wealth gap was larger than anything that exists in America today. But here's what that money couldn't buy: medical science that could reliably treat heart disease. Louise Boldt died at 41 from what would likely be a treatable condition today. All of George Boldt's wealth, all his connections to the best doctors in New York City, couldn't prevent sudden death from cardiovascular failure. The Gilded Age was obsessed with displays of wealth precisely because wealth was new to most of these families and seemed unlimited. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built the breakers in Newport for $7 million in 1895, over $230 million today, for a summer cottage used 3 months per year. The Astors, the Belmonts, the Morgans all competed in architectural excess. But look at what happened to many of these families within one generation. The Vanderbilt fortune, once estimated at over $200 billion in today's dollars, was gone by the 1970s. Not gradually diminished, gone. No Vanderbilt descendant inherited wealth from the railroad fortune. Why? Because display destroys wealth. Maintaining the breakers cost a fortune annually. Property taxes, staff, upkeep, these expenses consumed wealth without generating returns. Building monuments to success prevented accumulation of sustainable wealth. Here's the real lesson that nobody wants to hear. George Boldt's abandonment of Hart Island Castle might have been the most financially sound decision of his life. Completing it would have meant ongoing maintenance costs of $50,000 to $100,000 annually in period dollars. That's $1.5 to $3 million per year today. For a property he would use perhaps 3 months annually at most. Think about that. The castle would have consumed 25 to 50% of his annual income just in maintenance, staff, and operations. It would have been the most expensive monument to grief imaginable, draining his estate annually while providing nothing but painful reminders. By abandoning it, Boldt avoided decades of hemorrhaging cash into a property that served no purpose for him. Yes, the original $2.5 million was lost, but stopping prevented losing another $50,000 to $100,000 every year for the rest of his life. This is the calculation nobody makes when building these monuments, the annual carrying costs that continue long after construction ends. A $80 million castle isn't an $80 million expense. It's an $80 million expense plus $3 million annually forever. Over 30 years, you're spending more on maintenance than you spent building it. But here's what's even more revealing. Boldt's estate at his death in 1916 was $5 to $7 million. If he had completed the castle and maintained it for those 12 years, annual costs would have consumed $600,000 to $1.2 million, meaning his estate would have been reduced by as much as 20%. His heirs would have inherited significantly less. The abandonment, however painful emotionally, was economically rational. The sunk cost of $2.5 million was already lost. Throwing good money after bad would have compounded the error. Wait a minute. Let's think about what this means for display spending generally. If the carrying costs of displaying wealth consume wealth faster than the wealth grows, display guarantees eventual impoverishment. This is mathematical, not moral. The breakers cost approximately $6 to $8 million annually to maintain today, operated as a museum by the Preservation Society of Newport County. No private family could afford those costs on anything less than a $200+ million fortune, and even then it would significantly impede wealth growth. The Vanderbilts built over a dozen properties of similar scale. Do the math on those annual costs, and you see why the fortune evaporated. George Boldt actually understood this at a business level. His hotels generated revenue. The Waldorf Astoria wasn't just expensive display, it was profitable infrastructure. He knew the difference between assets that generated returns and assets that consumed resources. But Hart Island was emotional, not rational. It was pure display, pure monument, pure expense with no return except psychological. And when the psychological benefit turned negative after Louise's death, the rational economic decision was abandonment. Here's the brutal truth. If George Boldt had invested that $2.5 million in productive assets instead of a castle, more hotel properties, railroad stocks, Standard Oil shares, Carnegie steel bonds, his estate at death could have been $20 to $30 million instead of $5 to $7 million. The castle didn't just cost $2.5 million. It cost the opportunity to grow that $2.5 million into serious generational wealth. This is what display spending actually costs, not just the initial expense, but the lost compounding of that capital over time, plus the ongoing expenses that prevent future accumulation. And here's what nobody wants to acknowledge. Every Instagram photo of a luxury car, every TikTok mansion tour, every flexing of expensive watches and designer clothes, this is the same mistake, just at smaller scale. The money spent on display is money not working to generate future wealth. The emotional satisfaction of showing success prevents the actual accumulation of sustainable success. The Boldt Castle sits as physical proof that the most expensive luxury is the monument you build to your own success or emotions, not because of what it costs to build, because of what it costs to maintain and what you sacrifice in opportunity. Now, let's look at what Boldt Castle actually represents today, because the final irony reveals something about how tragedy becomes commodity. Since 1977, over 5 million people have paid to tour Boldt Castle. 5 million people who spent money to see someone else's abandoned dream. At current admission rates of $12 to $15, that's $60 to $75 million in gross admission revenue over 47 years. Add gift shop sales, boat tour revenue, hotel stays in the region, restaurant meals. The total economic impact of George Boldt's abandoned castle likely exceeds $200 million. The abandoned castle generates more economic value as a ruin than it ever would have as a completed residence. Think about that. Failure became more profitable than success would have been. If Boldt had completed the castle and used it as a private summer home, it would have generated zero tourism revenue. It would have been just another wealthy estate, occasionally glimpsed by passing boats, but otherwise invisible to the public. His actual completed hotels generated income, but this incomplete castle generates more interest and revenue as a monument to abandonment. Here's what this reveals. We place higher value on dramatic failure than on quiet success. The incomplete monument to lost love attracts millions of visitors. The successfully completed Waldorf Astoria that Boldt actually managed, demolished in 1929 and forgotten. His business success, bringing European luxury hospitality standards to America, training a generation of hotel managers, building a profitable empire, generates no tourism. But his abandoned castle? That's worth preserving, worth visiting, worth spending tens of millions on restoration. This is the cultural pathology on display. We memorialize excess and tragedy while forgetting competence and success. Boldt's actual achievements in hospitality created far more value for far more people than his castle ever could. But the castle failed dramatically, and dramatic failure captures attention in ways that steady success never does. The current restoration efforts reveal another irony. They're actively undermining the very thing that made the castle famous. By completing interior rooms, by finishing decorative elements, by realizing Boldt's architectural vision, they're erasing the evidence of abandonment that made it interesting. Every room they complete is a room that no longer shows the moment construction stopped. Every decorative element they finish is evidence they've destroyed of Boldt's telegram. They're slowly transforming it from the castle that love abandoned to the castle that was eventually finished by a government agency 70 years later. In another 20 years, if current restoration continues, Boldt Castle will look essentially complete. The dramatic evidence of abandonment will exist only in photographs and historical accounts. The physical manifestation of Boldt's grief will be papered over with modern restoration work done by contractors who never met George or Louise Boldt. Is that preservation? Or is it erasure disguised as honor? Here's what George Boldt understood that we've forgotten. Some things should remain incomplete. Some monuments to loss should not be finished, because finishing them erases the meaning. He refused to complete the castle because completion would have been a lie, pretending that life continued normally when it had been shattered. We've decided to tell that lie for him, to complete what he couldn't bear to finish, to create the illusion that grief can be overcome through perseverance and public funding. The castle as it exists today, partially restored, partially ruined, forever incomplete, is a compromise that satisfies no one. It's not the pristine monument Boldt imagined. It's not the complete ruin that abandonment created. It's a managed tourist attraction that packages tragedy as entertainment and the final brutal irony. This is exactly what Boldt was trying to avoid by abandoning it in the first place. So here's what the numbers tell us when you add everything up and stop romanticizing the tragedy. George C. Boldt spent what would be $75 to $80 million today building a monument to love on Hard Island. When love ended suddenly with Louise's death at 41, he made the economically rational but emotionally devastating decision to abandon the project completely. 300 workers lost their jobs. Millions in value evaporated. Specialized materials and completed work slowly deteriorated over 73 years. The castle was eventually sold for $1 to a government authority who has since spent over $50 million stabilizing and partially restoring it. This means we've now spent nearly as much preserving the ruin as Boldt spent creating it. The abandoned castle has generated over $200 million in economic impact through tourism, far more than it ever would have generated as a private residence. Display destroys wealth. Building monuments to emotion or success creates assets that consume resources without generating returns. The annual maintenance costs of luxury display properties often exceed the growth rate of the wealth that created them, ensuring eventual impoverishment. This was true in 1904. It's true today. Boldt's castle sits unfinished because he understood something we refuse to acknowledge, that the grandest gestures can become the cruelest reminders, that what you build to demonstrate love can hurt too much to complete, and that sometimes the most expensive thing you can do is abandon what you've already invested in. The 73 years of abandonment destroyed millions in value. The subsequent restoration has cost millions more. And what exists today is neither Boldt's vision nor an authentic ruin. It's a managed tourist attraction that packages grief as entertainment while slowly erasing the evidence of the tragedy that made it famous. Here's what you need to understand. Wealth without wisdom leads to waste. Building monuments leads to maintenance obligations. Display spending prevents accumulation. And the most expensive luxury is the one you build for emotional reasons, because when emotions change, the monument remains. George Boldt earned what would be $6 million annually today and died with what would be $140 to $200 million in total wealth. If he had invested the castle's $80 million cost in productive assets instead, his estate could have been worth $400 to $500 million. The difference, $200 to $300 million, is the actual cost of that monument to love, not what he spent. What he lost by spending it there instead of elsewhere. And nobody's talking about this because acknowledging it requires confronting uncomfortable truths, that our culture values dramatic failure over quiet success, that we memorialize excess while forgetting competence, that we've spent 50 years and $50 million preserving someone else's inability to cope with grief, and that we market this as romantic when it's actually tragic. The real Boldt Castle story isn't about eternal love. It's about how unlimited wealth provides no protection against life's fundamental tragedies. It's about how the monuments we build to our emotions often become monuments to our inability to let go. It's about how display spending destroys more wealth than it demonstrates. 300 workers dropped their tools on a frozen island in January 1904 and never picked them up again. Over a century later, new workers are picking up different tools to finish what grief stopped. The irony is complete. That's the dark story of America's forgotten castle. Not forgotten because it was abandoned, remembered because it was never completed, and profitable today precisely because tragedy attracts tourism better than success ever could.